emodels.co.uk. Make something awesome. Orks love checkers and they appear all over Orks stuff. They look like they might be complicated, but they're not really. Modellers with airbrushes or rattle cans have the easiest time simply making masks out of little squares of masking tape and spraying over those. But for those of you who can only brush paint, it's a little more involved. Now, I don't really need to show you how to cut squares out, so instead I chose to completely brush paint my checkers. I'm going to add them to the model here and here, and here's some I made earlier. That's what we're going for. I'm going to paint black and white checkers, so oddly I'm going to need 4 colours. I'm using Citadel paints for this. I used Celestra Grey, Ulthuan Grey, White Scar and Abaddon Black, although I won't use the White Scar until we do paint chipping later. I started with Celestra Grey. Now you might ask, why do I need all these colours and not just black and white for black and white checkers? Well, this is a lesson that you must apply to all the painting you do, not just for this pattern. As you gain experience, you'll learn that some paints are horribly transparent and some tend to be more opaque. Now, in the Citadel range, they actually separate these out as layer paints, which are more transparent, and base paints, which are more opaque. For other paint brands, it will vary from colour to colour. However, normally it is well known that certain colours, white, yellows and reds especially, are magnificently transparent and a living nightmare to paint with over darker colours. So, for example, if you paint yellow over blue, it can come out looking green. Blue plus yellow equals green. Also, if you're painting over a dark colour such as a black primer coat, it'll take many more coats of paint to hide the darker layer than if you are painting with a more opaque colour, and you can end up with a terrible looking lumpy paint job. So the trick is to be aware of how underlying colours show through transparent paints and prime or underpaint accordingly. In the same way that I primed this model with a light grey colour because red can be very transparent, so I must put something neutral between the dark grey of these panels and the white they'll eventually be. That's why I'm starting with Celestra Grey. Celestra Grey is a base paint. This means it's nice and opaque and will completely hide anything beneath it with only a small number of coats. It's also a neutral colour and so will not tint or change any colour painted over it. I used a nice big brush to make sure that I had a good reservoir of paint and to ensure that I could flatten it out and keep brush strokes to a minimum. Now, although it could cover the dark grey easily with just a couple of coats, I find thinning the paint a little more than normal and applying more thinner coats can give a nice smooth finish. I applied this as 5 very thin coats. The first few are streaky, but this goes away. You can apply it thicker to cover with less coats, but the work we'll need to do here to get this to the final checker pattern can result in 10 or 20 layers or more of paint by the time I've finished, so they must be thin to preserve detail. Once I arrived at a nice even layer of Celestra Grey, I was ready for the next colour. Keep in mind that this is an Ork vehicle and they're not going to have crisp, perfect or neat paintwork, so I wasn't fussed if there was a tiny faint hint of the undercoat here and there. It just added to the cobbled together aesthetic. The next colour is Ulthuan Grey, and as you can see, this is a layer paint. It's not as opaque as a base paint and is more likely to show the underlying colours through it, hence the need for the previous paint. It would take approximately a bajillion layers of this to hide that original dark grey if we hadn't prepped it with Celestra Grey first. Again, I applied this a little thinner than I normally would to allow me to get coverage with a nice, smooth and thin layer of paint. The aim here was to cover over the Celestra Grey as much as possible. In total, I applied 6 coats, making it 11 coats of paint overall so far. 11 coats of paint straight from the pot would be an ungodly mess right now. Always thin your paints. Now, you may be surprised to realise that once I had the Ulthuan Grey down, that was the white coat complete. I won't be using the actual white colour at this time, that's for later. Now, this may not seem logical, but in the same way that sometimes instead of painting black, you should paint dark greys and darken them when needed, when it comes to whites, it's better to stop at a light off-white colour and not actually go all the way to white. Why? Well, if you paint something actual white, then you have no way to ever add highlights to it because you can't go lighter than the white it already is. If you stop at an off-white, then you're free to add white highlights later on. And here's a secret: 99% of the time, your brain will interpret an off-white as being white anyway, until an actual white is present. That panel right now looks pretty white, huh? Let me plonk the white scar next to it. Now, it may not really come out on camera for you, but in reality, there is a noticeable difference between the Ulthuan Grey and the white scar. But when you can only see Ulthuan Grey surrounded by reds and greys and silvers and nothing actually white, your brain accepts it as white. And given that it'll be weathered up later anyway, you'll have no problems leaving the white checkers in this colour, allowing you to highlight with white later if needed. Neat, huh? Now it was time to sort out the black squares. For this I used Abaddon Black. The first step in this many-step process is to rough out the grid for the squares. I used a fine brush for this, and the paint was very thin, much more than normal, so that it flowed easily and lightly from the brush. From this point on, there's going to be a lot of back and forth, and I couldn't afford to have any height to the paint, otherwise you would see raised humps and bumps where the lines are. It's more like an ink at this point. Now, some people actually like to use inks for this, but that might cause issues later on when we try and paint Ulthuan Grey over to tidy up. I wasn't fussed about neatness here, I just cared about getting a rough idea of the layout. Once I had it sketched, I applied the first of many very thin colour coats, more like a wash, to the black squares. Again, it looks like ass right now, but that's fine. I wasn't looking to get the squares fully opaque yet, because what happened next is what most video tutorials never show you: the epic back and forth fartarsery that takes ages. With the black squares sketched and coloured, I came back with the Ulthuan Grey, our white colour, and started to tidy up any mess. Squiggles, edges that were incorrect, bits where a black square went a bit wrong, sides that were a bit wonky, that sort of thing. Because I only applied a thin, wishy-washy coat of the black, covering it with the transparent Ulthuan Grey was not a problem. Using inks for the black might have required a whole mess of layers of the grey to cover. So I fettled with the grey, making everything neat. Once that was done, I went back in with another very thin coat of the black, again not expecting it to be totally opaque yet, to tidy and neaten up further. I applied this as another thin coat and not a single thick coat, as I knew that as I painted I'd see bits that needed further correction and tidy up and would most likely make mistakes and need to come back with the grey again, so it was important to work in thin, glaze-like coats of black. And this is the secret that most tutorials don't tell you. Rather than the usual
paint white base, paint black lines, fill black squares, checkers, complete,
it is in reality a constant round of back and forth, neatening, tidying, correcting, slowly building up the black opacity. It can take many rounds between colours, which is why it's important that the paints be thin, else you build up 1.5 foot of paint. And again, as this is an Ork vehicle, we can get away with slightly wonky squares and a bit of scruffiness, so don't crucify yourself because you think every square needs to be identical and have crisp 90-degree corners. They don't. Orks paint these by hand with a squig, as in they point a bitey squig at the grot who is doing the painting and tell it to paint faster. I had both sides of these inboard ailerons to do, and with the bombs already done it took me most of a day to complete. Tiring and a little tedious, but more than worth it. And although there may well be easier methods to brush paint them, this is the method I prefer to give me the best results, and really options are limited if you don't have an airbrush or rattle cans. No skill required, just patience. Once the checkers were painted in, a final step was to apply 2 or 3 layers of a light wash of a 25% Agrax Earthshade, 75% Lahmian medium mix, brushed over the area and then hit with a little neat water to spread it around. Although this is technically a weathering method, its purpose here is not to actually weather, but to unify the black and the white and soften any edges between the two. Now, I don't know why, but it seems to make it all come together and look a lot neater. It does make the white look weathered though at the same time, so just saves me a job later on.